Good evening. I'm Olivia Macchioni. I'm the Outreach and Visitor Experience Coordinator here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'd like to welcome you to Gay Berlin, Birthplace of a Modern Identity, a conversation between author Robert Beachy and Stonewall 50 Consortium founder Eric Marcus. The Museum of Jewish Heritage is honored to be co-presenting the program tonight with the Goethe Institute in conjunction with the Stonewall 50 Consortium celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising and 2019 World Pride in New York City. I also want to call your attention to some related programming. On Wednesday, June 26th of this month, the museum will be screening the film Dear Freddy, which follows an openly gay German Jewish athlete living in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And of course, I hope you will also visit our newest exhibition, the groundbreaking exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, which brings together more than 700 original objects and 400 photographs from around 20 institutions and museums around the world, including artwork and artifacts of the LGBT community. Many of you may already know the connection between Nazi Germany and the symbol of the pink triangle, used to designate gay men in concentration camps during the Holocaust. However, in the early 19th century, Berlin was at the forefront of the earliest international gay rights movement. What happened in between is meticulously chronicled in Robert Beachy's Gay Berlin, Birthplace of a Modern Identity. Professor Beachy trained as a German historian at the University of Chicago. In 2014, he moved to Seoul as professor of European history at Yonsei University. He has published 4 books on 18th and 19th century Germany, not including Gay Berlin, and is currently a Ben and Zelda Cohen Fellow at the Mandel Center for Holocaust Studies at the Holocaust Museum in DC. Beachy's book, Gay Berlin, is available in the Pickman Museum shop on the first floor, and there will also be a signing table in the first floor lobby after the program tonight. We're pleased to have Professor Beachy with us here tonight. Beyond the historical moment, Beachy also teaches us that the history of homosexuality under the Nazis can help to illuminate the relationship between right-wing movements and homosexuality in contemporary Western societies. We're also fortunate to have Professor Beachy in conversation with Eric Marcus. Eric Marcus is the founder and host of the award-winning Making Gay History podcast, which mines his decades-old audio archive of rare interviews to create intimate, personal portraits of both known and long-forgotten champions, heroes, and witnesses to history. Eric's books include the #1 New York Times bestselling autobiography of Olympic diving champion Greg Louganis. He is also founder and chair of the Stonewall 50 Consortium, comprised of nearly 200 organizations and institutions that are planning programming, exhibitions, and educational materials tied to the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. We're really looking forward to their conversation, and thank you all for joining us.
So I'm Eric Marcus. Robert Beachy. I get the fun job tonight because I get to ask you all the questions and learn more about your work. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to one of the most important LGBTQ historians in the United States who started doing research into our history here in the US before anybody else, Jonathan Ned Katz in the third row. Jonathan, I'd call you a living legend, but I hate when people call me that, so I'll spare you that line. You get to be a certain age and people start calling you things that make you feel really ancient. In fact, the Daily News did a piece about my podcast and me with the headline under my picture, Queer Relics. Oh. And I think they thought it was clever because it was about gay archives and that sort of thing, but I was a little bothered by it. And just a note about Stonewall 50 Consortium, since I sent Olivia that the numbers on our organization, and thank you, Olivia, for having us here, and thank you to the museum for hosting this event. We have 225 member organizations that have scheduled 400 events between June 1st and the end of June, and there are about 24 exhibitions around the city ongoing, and you can find information about all of them at the stonewall50consortium.org website, plus a Stonewall 50 Basics fact sheet that we collaborated on with several organizations. So you can learn all about Stonewall and go to all 400 events if you have. My grandmother used to say, with one tuchus, you can't go be in 2 places at one time. And I'd like to be in 400 places at once. So who here has read Robert's book? Great. because my next question for you is, for people here who haven't read your book, can you explain in brief what it's about?
I think the subtitle probably describes it as well as anything. Birthplace of a Modern Identity. So I was inspired when I discovered, I think already as a graduate student, that this word homosexuality is a German word originally, homosexuality, something that was only coined or at least published for the first time in 1869. And
yeah, it didn't show up in dictionaries here in the US until the early 20th century.
That's right.
Yeah.
So
if you were a homosexual, you couldn't find yourself in the dictionary.
Absolutely not.
No.
You'd have to look up something else, and you probably wouldn't find anything in an English language dictionary at that point.
So what was the name of the man who came up with the name, the word?
A man named Karl Kurtbenny. So he actually is fairly obscure. He's known primarily for coining the word, but I think it's significant that he used it for the first time in a pamphlet in which he was arguing against the continuation of the Prussian anti-sodomy law. So he was an activist of sorts. He always published his work anonymously, at least as it concerned anything related to gay rights. So,
how did you come across him, and how did you come across the history of the word?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I guess the very first time I thought about this was after I read Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, an introduction. And Foucault is, of course, a French historian. He is sometimes considered the first real historian of sexuality from the 1970s. So, but he makes a big deal out of the word, and he claims that there really wasn't any identity before this word was more or less invented, and so it required the word for people to begin to identify themselves.
So, when you say it was not an identity, was it then just a behavior?
Exactly.
So it's like there were people,
mm-hmm.
and some people had sex with someone of the opposite sex, and some people had sex with people of the same sex.
Exactly.
But everyone was just a people.
Everyone was just a people, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So how did that idea, the idea of identity, translate into this?
The book.
Yeah, but you say Birthplace of a Modern Identity. So
right.
so that's how you got into the subject.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More or less. Yeah. I guess I had a sort of theoretical interest in this business of identity, where it comes from, how it's constructed, if it makes sense to actually historicize it this way. I mean, and there are lots of people, or some anyway, who would, I think, disagree and claim that there have always been homosexuals. The word doesn't really make any difference. There have always been communities, at least in cities. But I do think something fundamentally changed in the second half of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So, and the language plays a role in that, I think, as well. So
it's interesting. When I in our work with Making Gay History and looking at Harry Hay, who was the founder of one of the founders of the Mattachine Society here in the U.S. in 1950, which wasn't the first gay rights organization in the U.S., but it's the one that survived. There was one in 1924
right.
that was founded and only existed for a short time.
Inspired, I should say, by what was going on in Berlin.
Yes. What was so interesting in hearing Harry Hay's story, because I interviewed Harry Hay, someone I actually didn't like at all, but his when someone tries to kiss you on the lips when you've just met them, and you're 30 and he's 70, it's an uncomfortable situation. But anyway, it was an interesting interview in that Harry came up with the idea of identity, a gay identity, in 1950, when the idea of gay identity, of homosexual identity, was already formulated in Germany nearly 100 years earlier. So he was almost reinventing the wheel.
Yes, I agree with that entirely. It has a lot to do with the kind of erasure that took place with the Second World War, with the persecution of the Nazis and so on.
So you discover that there's this word and there's an identity attached to it. what then compelled you to study how that identity evolved and then focus on this period of history in Germany?
Well, again, I guess I followed Foucault to some extent, and I ended up disagreeing with some of what he said.
In what regard? How?
Well, I'm not sure one can blame Foucault entirely, but at least his reception, especially in the 80s, early 90s, focused very much on what's sometimes been described as the medicalization of homosexuality. And so the identity itself, according to Foucault, or at least a lot of his interpreters, was being imposed by medical doctors, psychiatrists, sexologists, and it was always with a very sort of pejorative emphasis. It was something negative.
Right, because it wasn't always medicalized. Psychiatrists were not interested initially, and doctors weren't, in homosexuality or in curing it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there was a fair bit of interest already in Berlin by the late 19th century. But the other thing that I discovered when I started to look more carefully at Germany was that Berlin did, in fact, have a community of homosexuals, lesbians, cross-dressers, and this community, or maybe I should say these communities, were already, as I learned, as I write about in the book, fairly visible by as early as the 1890s. Also, as I already mentioned, the word homosexuality was coined by an activist of sorts, and as it turns out, there was a lot of other language that was being invented and used, and not by medical doctors, but by other kinds of activists. So again, I appreciated Foucault's initial insight, but I disagreed, I guess, in terms of the emphasis on this imposition of identity or the medicalization of identity. So.
I was so surprised in my work, when I first started doing my oral history book 30 years ago, I thought everything began at the Stonewall Uprising 50 years ago, and then was surprised to learn that there was a movement here in the US that started in 1950, and that there was an organization founded in 1924 that was broken up by the police. And then there was a Magnus Hirschfeld who founded an organization in 1897 in Berlin, and that there was this whole world that existed and then was wiped away. I was at the Schwules Museum in Berlin last year during the 150th anniversary celebration for Magnus Hirschfeld's birth, and there were printed magazines, really nice magazines, for people who would not have called themselves necessarily transsexuals then, but who were people we would now, or people who would now self-identify as transsexuals. And I was stunned at this whole world that existed, one that you document, but then disappeared. Well, I shouldn't say disappeared, that's a nice way of saying it, because it was destroyed.
Yeah.
So when you started looking at this world, what period did you focus on?
I guess I really did start in the second half of the 19th century. So I was, again, intrigued by the invention of this language. I really started to find that there was a lot going on already by, again, the 1890s, 1880s. The founding of Hirschfeld's gay rights organization is also pretty well documented. So there aren't a lot of archival materials, but he published so much that you can actually go to a good library, at least a research library, and if you read German, you can find so much material that documents this organization and all kinds of elements of Berlin's gay culture.
Yeah, and this is the 100th anniversary of the founding of Magnus Hirschfeld's Sexuality Research Institute in Berlin, and
That's right.
And the reason that there isn't as much archival material as there might be is that what happened?
It was, of course, destroyed, almost not razed to the ground, but all the materials in the institute itself were more or less burnt, or there were just a couple of things that seemed to have been preserved.
Yeah.
People took some things, but and they appear every so often. But
Yeah, I was surprised to learn that that those pictures that we're probably all familiar with, that I remember seeing as a child, there's film of a book burning in Berlin early on in 1933. And that was the burning of Magnus Hirschfeld's library, from what I understand.
In part, yeah.
In part, yeah.
There's even a picture of someone carrying a bust of Hirschfeld, and I think they were throwing the bust on the fire as well.
Right, right. And he was a particular threat because he was a Jew and he was gay.
Yeah.
And from what I understand as well, so the Sexuality Institute, actually I should let you, since you're the author, explain what was his institute that he founded in 1919 and what was its influence at the time?
Well, it was called the Institute for Sexual Science, and he had this vision of establishing a kind of sexology as a proper field of research. He hoped that it would eventually become established in universities, and so this was supposed to be a kind of academic institution. I mean, it wasn't officially tied to any university. It was more or less private, but it had a research agenda. He expected to treat patients. There were different kinds of small surgeries. They conducted some of the first sex or gender confirmation or sexual reassignment confirmation surgeries there. So, you know, it was actually sort of vast, we might say, in its undertaking. There was also a museum, there was a public outreach program, so just an awful lot going on.
One of the things I read was that the people would come for treatment, homosexuals who didn't want to be homosexuals, and they barely knew anything about hormones in those days, and they did some pretty horrifying experiments.
Yeah, yeah.
Shall I describe one?
Sure, yeah.
So they would take a heterosexual testicle, slice it in half, transplant it into the abdomen of a homosexual, castrate the homosexual, with the idea that he would be made straight by the heterosexual hormones. Didn't work.
No, it didn't work.
Because they also didn't understand the problems of transplantation with. No, they didn't. Yeah.
No.
And when I read that, I thought, ooh, that's pretty horrible. But the goal was to treat people who were desperate, because people would come to Hirschfeld begging to be castrated because they didn't want to be gay.
That's right.
Yeah, and he was just trying to help people be who they wanted to be.
Well, he was also interested in this primitive science of sex hormones, and as much as anything, I think he wanted to prove that sex hormones were responsible for sexual orientation. So, I mean, he always had this commitment to the idea that sexual orientation, gender identity were really caused by biology. And so when this Austrian endocrinologist, Eugen Steinach, came along with his rat experiments already before the First World War, Hirschfeld was incredibly excited because he thought, wow, this is the science that's going to prove my theory. Now I know that I'm right. And so I think he certainly wanted to help his patients, including those who didn't like being gay or wanted to be heterosexual, but he was also really, really fascinated by this science, and he believed in sex hormones. He thought it was possible to really prove that this was the source and this was the cause of everything.
And he was ahead of what medical science could manage, and medical science obviously still hasn't quite figured out what the magic formula is that makes homosexuals.
I don't think so.
And at this age, I don't actually even care anymore. This is how I am, and I'm going to die this way. There were a couple of people who you talk about who figured prominently into Hirschfeld's work. Harry Benjamin, and you'll correct me if I pronounce this incorrectly, Willibald Baron von Sattler-Grün, known as the Baroness. And the Baroness sounded pretty colorful.
Yeah. He or she is the more difficult one to talk about, probably, because the biography is fairly obscure. So,
do you want to start with Harry Benjamin?
Yeah, Harry Benjamin is of course, a name probably some of you, or many of you, maybe all of you, are familiar with.
How many people here have heard the name Harry Benjamin? Not so many. I'd never heard of him before I started working on my podcast.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, he was from Berlin, or at least close to Berlin. He was from Germany. He met Hirschfeld probably around, 1908, 1910, and he was interested in studying science, or medicine specifically. He was also very interested in Hirschfeld's work.
And he was living in the U.S. by then, wasn't he?
No, he moved to the U.S. Just before the First World War.
Okay.
So he came to the U.S. and then he studied in the U.S. But because he was German, he was also Jewish, he, of course, was able to read German, and he always followed Hirschfeld's publications. He followed everything that the Institute for Sexual Science was doing after 1919, and he came frequently to Berlin from the U.S. So, but he was also extremely inspired by these primitive attempts to experiment with sex hormones, and along with this, there were some very crude surgeries that were being conducted in Berlin, also a few other places in Germany, in Dresden.
To sex reassignment surgery, we call it today. I've seen the diagrams, and if you're squeamish, they're not to be looked at.
That's right.
Yeah. But it was pioneering.
It was pioneering, right?
What about the Baroness? Not much.
A really colorful figure who was originally from Austria and ended up was in London for a time, and then eventually came to Berlin, and then was closely associated with Hirschfeld and with the gay rights organization, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and it was also a fairly prominent cross-dresser, or as I guess the Germans would have called her in the early 20th century, a Damenimitator, a female impersonator. Mm-hmm. So somebody, she actually performed. Mm-hmm. As I recall, I think she smoked heavily and died of cancer.
Oh. So Berlin was different from the rest of Germany, or the rest of the major cities, in how gay people lived, or how homosexuals lived. What do you think, and first if you can characterize what Berlin was like during the Weimar years, and then why was it different from other parts of Germany?
It takes a book to answer that question, I'd say. But
I know one. So let's say just a typical night in Berlin in 1920 for somebody like you or me, but if we were like 25 or 30, what might our life be like that night? A weekend night in Berlin.
Right. Well, 1920 was a pretty outrageous year. I mean, the government itself was incredibly shaky. There was actually a putsch attempt in 1920. Hirschfeld, actually, when he was giving a lecture in Munich, was beaten.
He was almost killed. He was left for dead.
He was left for dead.
In fact, he read his obit the next morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but I mean, the city of Berlin, by all accounts, was in a state of turmoil. And there was already a kind of galloping inflation, so the currency was not worth very much. It was a great place to visit if you had dollars, pounds, even francs, Dutch guilders. So there were already a lot of tourists who were coming to Berlin, in part because it was so inexpensive, right? So, but what people describe is a state where the Berliners themselves were increasingly desperate. I mean, so this was just after the First World War. The Germans had been defeated. They faced all of the impositions or all of the demands of the Treaty of Versailles. So nightlife itself would have been extremely outrageous, I think, in part because of this feeling of desperation, and also presumably because of some of the new sort of liberal measures that had been introduced by this new democratic government, which was also controlled by the Social Democratic Party, which was a formally Marxist party at this point.
And what were some of the liberalizations that happened during that time that affected gay people in particular?
Sure. For one, censorship was at least theoretically eliminated It was reintroduced to some extent, but it was much easier to publish journals, magazines. So there was a burgeoning gay press at this point already. Different kinds of journals and magazines were appearing. The cinema was also something that was exploding. And Weimar cinema is incredibly famous and important. And there were also a lot of, or at least some gay-themed films. And
1919, different from the others, was
Exactly.
Hirschfeld's film.
Exactly.
Has anyone seen clips of that? Yeah. It's startling to see it.
It is startling.
Can you describe what the film was about?
Yeah, it's the main character is a kind of tortured, repressed, closeted homosexual violinist, and he, I think, has some sort of contact with a male prostitute who also blackmails him eventually, but along the way he falls in love, I think, with one of his students, and it doesn't have a happy ending, unfortunately.
No, but he seeks the help of Magnus Hirschfeld, who's in the film.
Exactly.
And Magnus Hirschfeld co-wrote the film.
Exactly, and I think we might say co-produced it
Right.
maybe as well.
And it was thought to have been destroyed by the Nazis, but some of it survived.
That's right. I think it was discovered, a big chunk of it, in an archive in Moscow, I think, in the 90s.
Yeah, and I think 1987 it was shown on PBS.
Oh, that early, okay.
With Vito Russo narrating.
Ah, okay.
We couldn't find the video. We looked everywhere for it.
Yeah.
But it's an extraordinary, if you haven't seen it, you can find it online. Actually, we did a Magnus Hirschfeld episode of our podcast, and we have a link to the clip. I'm going to shift dramatically at the moment. You teach in Seoul, South Korea, and this seems like a life non sequitur.
Life non sequitur.
So how did you wind up?
That might be as bad as a queer relic. I'm not sure, but
how did you wind up in Seoul, South Korea, and what do your students and colleagues think of your work and this book specifically?
well,
So first, how did you wind up in Seoul?
I don't have any good explanation for why I went there. So
And you're just back. You arrived yesterday morning at 5 a.m.
Right. That's right. So I haven't been back in the country very long, but they advertised a job internationally, and I interviewed for it at the American Historical Association conference, which that year was in Washington D.C. So that was convenient because I was in Baltimore, and I got the job, and I thought it looked really, really interesting. So I just decided to do it, and I have to admit, I hadn't even traveled in Asia at the point when I was moving to Seoul. So that was.
So you weren't fluent in Korean?
No.
Does speaking German help?
No, not in the least. No. I teach, of course, in English. So.
Right. And I was just wondering. And what is how are gay people treated differently, or are they treated differently here and in Seoul? And
Well,
are you out to your students and faculty members?
Yeah, I'm completely out. So, and although you might assume that somebody who wrote a book like this would be, I mean, you don't have to out yourself exactly, do you? I mean,
Well, sometimes I have people who ask me, because I've only written, most of my books are on gay subjects, and I've had people ask me if I'm gay.
Yeah.
And it's like,
You don't wear enough pink or something? Is that?
Well, I don't know what it is. It's just a little striking when because people don't necessarily assume.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe that's true. That's certainly true of Koreans.
Right,
So
and they assume you're American.
they assumed I was American, yeah. I
Right,
guess
and that doesn't necessarily equate to being gay.
No, that's true.
No.
I can say I went to the Seoul Gay Pride Parade about 2 weeks ago, and it was the first time that I was in the country for the Gay Pride Parade, because it's always in later in June or even in July, and that was remarkable. I mean, in years past, I always received reports, and it was frightening. I mean, there were sometimes more counter-protesters, it sounded like, than there were actual people at the parade or in the parade, and so I wasn't sure what to expect. I mean, there's a very vocal evangelical Christian minority in Korea, and not unlike the religious right in this country.
Yeah, no, there's
So-
on my block in Chelsea on 20th Street, there's an evangelical Korean church that meets in the
Yeah.
auditorium of the elementary school.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, in the heart. Well, Chelsea isn't gay Chelsea the way it once was, but
Yeah.
it always struck me as an odd juxtaposition of the evangelicals down the block from where we live.
But I have to say, this parade was amazing. I mean, there were thousands and thousands of people marching, and they created a real sort of atmosphere. I mean, there were enough of them that it was like a real gay pride parade. I mean, with people on the streets, and there seemed to be a lot of straight supporters, and I think it's an issue of generations. So the people in the parade were really, really young, or they looked really young. I mean, that means they were probably 30 and under. So,
Right.
But I was extraordinarily impressed. I mean, it almost made me cry, actually. So I mean, there were lots and lots and lots of students, and I think there were lots and lots of straight students supporting their friends as well. So. And that conformed to my feeling about my own students. So they're actually very open, and they're also very, very interested. So
they're interested in the work you've done, the research?
yeah, they are. They're also interested in classes that I teach on history of sexuality. I actually just had a seminar this spring on the history of sexuality, and out of maybe 20 students, there were 6 who picked themes related to gay history. I mean, so about a third were actually so interested that they wanted to write, final papers.
What's the history of homosexuality in contemporary Korea, South Korea?
Well, there are no laws. There have never been laws, but there is a real social conservatism. It comes in part from, I think, this evangelical Christian minority, but there's also this kind of neo-Confucian culture that really emphasizes family and deference to authority, and about the most important thing for any young person to do is marry and give your parents grandchildren and preferably a son or a grandson.
So it's like Jews.
Oh, well, yeah.
And that's what it was like with my grandparents. Marry someone of the same faith and have grandchildren, have children. Yeah. I mean, it's a little different. I'm half joking, but in that way, it's a conservative family culture, family-centered culture, the way that traditional Jewish culture is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I have more questions for you about your book and about Germany and German history. I want to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. And if there are no questions, which I'm sure there will be questions, but if there are no questions, I have more questions for you. So what's next in terms of books?
I'm working on a project on the Nazi persecution of gay men in the 30s and 40s, and then the sort of history of the Nazi anti-gay law, which was passed in 1935 and survived in West Germany until 1969.
Is that paragraph 175?
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm curious as to whether you have found any recorded interviews with gay people who were caught up in the Holocaust. Something I've been looking for and have not found.
Yeah, there aren't many. There are a few. There's the Show Foundation has a huge.
I know they have a huge collection. But do they have?
I think there's 7 out of however many tens of thousands.
The Fortunoff Video Archive of Holocaust testimonies at Yale has 4,400 interviews, and not one person self-identified as gay. Yeah, which makes sense given the way homosexuality remained stigmatized after the war. Yeah. I'll open it to questions. The question that I'm going to ask later is what surprised you in your research for this book, but I'll hold that. So questions from the audience. I see a hand all the way in the back. Let's start with that. And there's a microphone traveling around. But these are really questions. So if you have a comment, make it extremely short, and then ask your question.
Good evening. I just wanted to ask, there was a German fellow in Chicago in the 1920s. His name was, I believe, Gerber.
Yes.
Henry Gerber, yeah.
Did he correspond with Magnus Hirschfeld? Because he started a magazine similar to what came out in the 50s, but he seems to have died out from the history.
Yeah, it gets mentioned in George Chauncey's Gay New York, but I don't think there's not a lot to know about it.
No, but Henry Gerber actually, so Henry Gerber was a German immigrant who spent time apparently at the institute, at Hirschfeld's Institute in Berlin, and was inspired by Hirschfeld's work to start a gay rights organization in Chicago, which was wiped out very quickly by the police. And it was one of his followers who inspired Harry Hay, who founded the Manishing Society in 1950. So I think it's an interesting thread that we can trace back from our movement all the way to Berlin in 1897. Movement was wiped out in Germany, and then we reintroduced or helped reintroduce the movement there. And in large part, Hirschfeld's history was erased and has only been rediscovered in recent decades. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, there were people in the late 40s, early 50s. I mean, there was an attempt actually to, in West Germany, to refound the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and there was something like it, but it never really got off the ground.
Yeah.
So there were a couple of people, Hiller, a few others, who survived the war and also returned to Germany.
So Gerber does figure prominently. Is here in the front.
Good evening. First of all, thank you all so much for a wonderful presentation, for a wonderful conversation about the history of modern identity in Berlin. My name is Henry. I am a student in GWU in DC. This question is directly related to Weimar Republic. As much as we're talking about the Berlin in 1920s with all the freedoms for LGBTQ communities, the paragraph 175 of German Penal Code still exists, which punishes homosexuality behavior. How much did Weimar Republic enforce this law specifically? Or shall we say, how much did the political environment of Weimar Republic shape the freedom that we are experiencing for LGBTQ communities in Berlin? Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, so the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, all the other organizations, they never succeeded in reforming the law. And so it remained the law of the land right up until 1933, and then the Nazis introduced a more draconian version in 1935. But at least in Berlin, and I think it's fair to generalize about some of the other larger cities, there was a general toleration. So there's a report from one Berlin police officer in which he claims that in his 25 years, also working some of the time in a task force responsible for policing homosexuals in Berlin, he never ever caught a couple doing something that was technically illegal. So what that meant is the only time that anybody was ever really charged and punished in some way was when they were accused by someone else. So it required a witness, and you can easily imagine that that would happen very often, and if so, only under very particular circumstances. So, the law remained on the books, and it was a threat in certain ways. It also opened homosexual men to the threat of blackmail. So it was something that everybody, who was involved with the issue wanted to reform and change. But
what year was it repealed?
Well, in West Germany, it was actually only removed entirely from the law code in 1994. But the reform in West Germany came in 1969, and I should add that what was reformed in 1969 was the Nazi code from 1935. So the West Germans actually maintained the Nazi law after the founding of the Federal Republic for a period of 20 years. And in some ways, the 1950s were almost worse, or at least in terms of the number of arrests and successful prosecutions worse than the Nazi period, which is incredible when you think about it. So it was really a dark age in so many ways.
So the gay men who were released who survived the concentration camps were freed into a world where they were still criminalized.
Exactly, and there were people who were kept in prison after 1945 to serve out the remainder of their Nazi sentences. And so because they were, they weren't considered persecuted, they were simply homosexuals. So
just simply.
Yeah.
Question here in the front, and then we'll go back to the back. I just want to keep you running back and forth the whole time.
I love it.
So there's this trope in film or art about the alliance between gay men and fascism. Visconti portrayed that in The Damned. And I know that there's that famous, is it Night of the Knives or something like that? Love the
Night
Long
of
Knives.
the Long Knives, yeah.
So but aside from that, which is fairly, unique to that kind of Sturmabteilung thing,
Yeah.
was there, in your research, have you uncovered that there was sort of a implicit alliance between some homosexual subcultures and fascism or Nazism? And in sort of as a corollary to that, was being gay, did that send you to a concentration camp, or did you really have to do something like have public sex in the Tiergarten, or just being really out there to get a pink triangle and go to Auschwitz?
Yeah. Well, the first question is a really difficult one to address and to answer, and in part because of the way that's been politicized. A lot of homophobes make claims about the connections between fascism and homosexuality, and that continues today among the religious right to some extent in this country and elsewhere. So anytime anybody says anything about this, they get themselves in trouble, I'd say. So but I have to say, in German culture, there is a kind of right-wing nationalism. It emerges already before the First World War that is linked to a kind of homoerotic sort of culture. And there's actually an organization that's founded, and there's one individual in particular named Hans Blüher, who develops a theory of the German Männerbund, or the male society, male association, which is also homosexual, or at least more than homosocial. It's homosocial and homoerotic. So there's something to that stereotype, and I don't exactly like to admit it, but I also don't think it's fair to deny it. So, that could be discussed for a couple of hours tonight, but there's no such time. And your second question is a really good one. It's not the case that being homosexual was anything like a death sentence, and it certainly didn't even mean that you would be, arrested and sent to prison. So, and I'm trying to figure out exactly why some people got arrested and why a lot of people, got off scot-free and survived the war.
I wonder if it had anything to do with men who were gender nonconforming.
That played some role.
So that those who were more identifiably gay got caught up.
Sure.
And those who could pass didn't.
Yes and no, yeah. But I've found in my Gestapo records, in my court files, I've found cases where somebody caught cross-dressing in the late 30s in public, arrested, interrogated, was released because he managed to convince a Nazi or Gestapo officer that he in fact wasn't homosexual. He was simply a cross-dresser. Right. He was a transvestite.
Right.
And so there, I have at least half a dozen cases where people get a slap on the wrist and told you better not go out in public, in
Do your
women's
dressing up
clothing
at home.
anymore. Yeah. So it's a really complicated situation.
When do you think this book will be published?
It'll take me another 2 years.
Do you have a name for it?
I had a tentative title. I don't like it anymore.
Do you want some help?
Yeah. Actually, if people have ideas, I'm open to
Are
suggestions.
you comfortable with the tentative sharing the tentative title?
I don't know. Long Knives was.
Long Knives.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a problem. We'll take other questions. In the back, in the plaid shirt.
In your research, did you see any particular singling out of gay people in the camps for specific punishments? And could you speak a little bit about what happened when others were released? According to what I've read, according to paragraph 175, many German gay people were not released from the camps. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, by all accounts, there were hierarchies, and usually the political prisoners were sort of the camp elites, and they often functioned as capos or block captains, and homosexuals were always at the bottom of this hierarchy. So they were. And
Jewish homosexuals. Bottom of the
presumably, and that's a question I'm actually exploring. Yeah. So I'm not sure.
So how do you do research when most people, the vast majority, chose not to be identified after the war?
Oh well. This is the single nice thing I could ever possibly say about, I guess, Nazis. They left a lot of records, and so what I have to work with are police and court records, and these are extraordinarily detailed. There are also a lot of records from all kinds of camps, not just death camps, also other concentration camps, and also there was a huge network of prisons. So I mean, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum has estimated now that there were probably 60,000 sort of incarceration sites in Europe.
60,000?
60,000 by the 1940s. So a single camp would have, sometimes dozens of sub-camps. So this was truly an archipelago of a carceral archipelago. I mean, it was more camps than you can imagine. So. There are lots and lots of materials, and it's possible to document a great deal. So
there were people, though. Your question, though, is also about people being left, being stuck once the camps were liberated.
Yeah, that happened. I mean, that is documented, and I'm not sure, how often or how frequently that was the case, but there are examples of that. I've found a mugshot album in Berlin that. Starts around 1942 and continues to about 1948. A mugshot album for gay inmates, and it's clear that there are a large number who aren't released in 45. I mean, so it's exactly this phenomenon that you're asking about.
Were there any lesbians who were incarcerated in the camps?
Yeah, there were a significant number. They were almost never incarcerated as lesbians. I mean, so.
I meant specifically, though, they were not specifically identified as lesbians and incarcerated.
Almost never.
Yeah. You have a question in the second row here, so we need the microphone all the way down front. No, we need the microphone because we can hear you, but the audience can't hear you.
I was going to ask about lesbians also, and do you write about lesbians in gay Berlin? And also, was there any role that they played at the Hirschfeld Institute?
So the question was, how do you address lesbians in the book, and were there lesbians involved in Hirschfeld's Institute?
Yeah, there's a lot less visibility. It's clear that there were at least a handful of sort of lesbian locales already before 1914, before the First World War, and then there were many more through the 20s into the early 30s. There was a very rich lesbian associational life. It's clear in the 1920s and early 30s. There were journals. There were at least 2 or 3 journals that were dedicated, or they were lesbian journals that were published at least monthly, so through most of the 20s into the early 30s. And there were also lesbians involved in the Institute for Sexual Science. So the way women were marginalized generally, I mean, you can make the same sort of claim about lesbians. And it's also very, very significant that the law never criminalized sex between women, at least not in Germany. It did in Austria. So there's a slightly different dynamic. But when it comes to trying to figure out things that are going on, also when it comes to motivation for political activism, the absence of a law criminalizing sex between women also means that there are fewer records, because there are no records, basically, at least no records produced by courts or by police, and there's also arguably less motivation in a certain sense, although, and I guess I can also say lesbian groups, gay male groups were also generally very, very segregated. So there was cooperation at points, but I wouldn't. This is still true in Berlin today. They don't get along with each other. I mean, it's really
when I went on the tour,
it's really perverse. I mean, in the clearest sense of that word.
When I went on a tour of the Schwules Museum, the gay museum in Berlin, that was explained to me that there remains this big rift between the men and the women in Berlin.
It's an issue with the leadership of the Schwules Museum as well.
Yeah.
I mean, they're fighting all the time. But
Yep.
it's really.
As I always say, gay people, we're very good at bringing all of our rage and hurt to our work and take it out on each other.
Yeah.
Yes, here in the 4th row.
Hi, I'm 72, and as a teenager, my first exposure to a positive literature about homosexuality was also my first exposure to the stories of Weimar, and I mean the Berlin stories, obviously. It's awkward because I think Isherwood has some entries into his diaries later that are pretty anti-Semitic, but putting that aside and putting Liza Minnelli aside, do you think his stories are valid, or do you think they're just total imagination?
Oh, they're valid. There's no question. I mean, I don't know what he experienced, but they certainly are supported by other accounts and other reports. There's a lot of literature. I mean, some of it's in the book, not all of it, but the stories are wild and crazy. I mean,
Wilder than the meatpacking district here in Manhattan.
I'm not sure about that. But,
Okay.
But,
All the way down in front of a comment.
I've heard that during the war there was a network of lesbians who helped gay Jews.
you should tell me more about that.
So afterwards tonight, make sure you speak with Robert. Over here in the front on the left, my left.
My limited understanding is that there was something sort of feminizing about the way that Germans treated Jewish masculinity, that Jewish men sort of couldn't be masculine in the way that Aryan men could be. I'm wondering what you make of that, and if there's intersections between that and homosexuality that have come up in theorists who've addressed the topic.
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's always present in any kind of anti-Semitic literature or propaganda, and it's certainly an element of Nazi propaganda. So I guess the question hasn't ever interested me that much because I don't really take it seriously on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's also the case that the progressive medical establishment that tended to support gay rights, including Hirschfeld, was very Jewish, you know. So in a certain way, they made themselves an easy target, you know. But you know, I guess I can't speak to you know that sort of anti-Semitic trope. You know, it's, so,
So I have a question for you before we go back to the audience for a couple of more questions, and then we'll wrap up. As you were researching Gay Berlin, what were some of the surprises for you? So I assume a lot of this material was new to you. What were some of the bigger surprises?
I guess maybe what I found really startling was the role played by the Berlin police already in the late 19th century. So there was one individual named
It's okay.
Meerscheit Hulessem, he has this terrible hyphenated name, who was responsible for policing queers, essentially.
Like the morals, the New York Police Department used to have a moral squad.
Exactly, yeah, a lot like that. Yeah. And he actually would bust up gay locales in the early 1880s, and it's not completely clear why or when, but in the mid-1880s, he adopted a policy of tolerating these gay venues, and even by the 1890s, cross-dresser balls, because it appeared that it was easier to, you know, sort of maintain control and sort of keep tabs on this community by not driving them underground. But what this also did is it created visibility that had never existed before, and it attracted, it became a laboratory, a kind of laboratory of sexuality. And so people who were interested in studying homosexuality, including Hirschfeld, including a lot of other sexologists and psychiatrists, came to Berlin. They would take tours. They'd go slumming and, you know, take tours of, you know, these gay venues and of these gay drag balls. And this was going on already in the 1890s. You know, but it was really ultimately a product of this police policy of allowing these kinds of venues, you know, to operate without any restrictions as long as the people there behave themselves. You know, so I guess that shocked me. And you know, as far as I can tell, the real motivation was that this law, paragraph 175, was impossible, actually almost impossible to enforce. I mean, so you actually couldn't easily catch people breaking the law. And to charge somebody for something like, you know, homosocial, I don't know, fraternization, you know, that was a hard charge to make. So there was no law against that.
So we'll take two more questions, and then I have a final question for you. I see a hand. We'll take three more questions. Here, back there, and then all the way in the back. We'll start. Actually, let's start all the way here in the front, because we've had almost no questions from women tonight. So we'll take four more questions. Quick ones.
Hi. So you've spoken a lot about state-inflicted violence on queer people, and something that's rising in this country are what we deem like hate crimes, especially against transgender women. Does your research focus at all on what we would call a hate crime now?
That's a great question, and I find so little evidence of that kind of those kinds of hate crimes. I mean, it's really, really rare. There's a case in 1934-35 where some Hitler youth are actually arrested for gay bashing in the Tiergarten, you know, because they're disturbing the peace in doing so. So I'm still trying to figure that out.
And let's start in the back.
Hi. So a couple of years ago, I went to the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and one of my big takeaways from there was that a lot of the Nazi, you know, their ability to take hold came from the liberal policies of the Weimar Republic and so, among like economic and political discontent, all of these liberal policies were seen by the people then as a threat to them. And I'm just curious if you see any parallels between what was happening then and what's happening now here. And
that's a great question, and it was going to be my last question. So that's a great question to ask. Do you see parallels?
Yes and no. I mean, writing about the parallels is a publishing industry right now. I mean, there's a small library about it already, so it's a good way to get a book published. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I mean,
Well, to modify the question a little bit, are there things that we can learn from the experience of what happened in the 1930s in Weimar Germany that apply in some way today? Are there lessons? Should we be more mindful because of what happened there? Not that it'll be repeated, but are there lessons?
Well, I guess the Weimar Republic was an experiment. It was the first democratic regime in Germany, and it was born in chaos and civil war, and the Constitution of the Weimar Republic was also in some ways disastrous. I mean, and I think that was maybe one of the points that the Jewish Museum exhibition makes. I mean, it has to do with the way very small parties were able to actually flourish or sort of take hold. And by 1930, the state was completely dysfunctional. So it almost seemed like just an inevitability that there would be some kind of coup or something horrible was going to happen. Everybody expected it. So I guess I'm not sure if they're parallels, but it does seem to me, and I think this is what a lot of people are saying now, norms are violated. The sort of give and take of a liberal democracy, it's not working, or a lot of things don't seem to be working. I mean, there are ways in which, one of the things that just drives me insane is the simple fact that the Republican Senate could refuse to consider Obama's nomination for the Supreme Court for a period of 8 months or however long that went on, and claim that this is something that needed to be resolved, by the next presidential election. That was absurd and completely unprecedented. So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that's going on that I think is troubling. I mean, when
breaking of norms.
Breaking of norms, yeah. So, if that happens enough, and if it goes on long enough, pretty soon, systems break down, and I mean, institutions then start to crack, and they don't function the way they're supposed to.
So in that way, there's a parallel. That things no longer functioned in Germany, which made it possible for the rise of fascism. There were, yes, right here. And, there was one question there, and then the last question up here in the front. I hope it's a good question.
One name that seems to be significantly absent is Sigmund Freud. I mean, he was writing in German in Austria, and if I recall, he wrote about cases of homosexual patients, yet could you speak about any correspondence perhaps between Hirschfeld and Freud, or why he seems to be left out?
Yeah, they corresponded briefly, and then they, I think, decided mutually that they didn't like each other. So, allegedly Freud made very disparaging remarks about Hirschfeld and about his homosexuality. So, Freud, of course, had, a psychodynamic theory of human sexuality, and he wasn't. I mean, I don't think anybody would describe him exactly as a homophobe, but he was kind of a homophobe. I mean, homosexuality was sort of a failure to work through the Oedipus complex or something like that. It wasn't, and he completely rejected Hirschfeld's, sort of biological determinism. So, and that was also in some ways politically expedient. I mean, it made, at least from Hirschfeld's perspective, it made sense to claim that this was, something that was hardwired, because if so, then there was no basis for discriminating. And of course, Freud's theory was something completely different than that. I mean, so they just never saw eye to eye.
And also, Freud's theory and the way psychiatrists looked at homosexuals created a lot of business for a lot of psychiatrists for a long time.
Yeah, especially after 1945, right?
Yeah,
50s and 60s,
the promise of cure, when there was no real possibility of, there was no disease, there's no cure.
Yeah, right.
Down here in front, in the red shirt. And that'll be our last question.
In your research, did you come across any similar things going on in Amsterdam, London, or Paris? And did some of the people in Berlin have boyfriends in those countries, and did they come visit them?
Well, there were these kinds of subcultures of sexual minorities in every big city. So, in that regard, there's nothing unique about Berlin. What I would argue is that the visibility in Berlin was unique, and the semi-official toleration was very different, say, from London. There was no law in Paris or in France, but then there was also no explicit gay rights movement and all of the other sorts of organizations and publications that went along with that. So the French never seemed to be as interested, and that doesn't mean that they were any less homosexual.
So Olivia, Robert will be signing books, correct? Outside here? Down. Yeah, and now we'll stay here for just a few minutes if people have questions for us individually. But I want to thank you, Robert, for being here tonight, all the way from Seoul, Korea.
Thank you for your great questions.